I walked into the hotel lobby wearing my favorite MAGA hat, just expecting a normal check-in, but the manager had other plans. He mocked me in front of everyone, treated me like trash, and made it very clear I wasn't welcome. What he didn't realize was that the person he just humiliated wasn't just any guest. I was about to be his new boss, and corporate had already given me full authority to turn his world upside down. Stepping into the hotel lobby, the atmosphere felt charged with tension from the very beginning. The front desk staff, usually expected to offer welcoming smiles, barely glanced up. But it was the manager who truly set the tone. His posture stiffened as soon as he caught sight of the MAGA hat perched on my head. A slow, mocking smirk played across his face, one that spoke louder than words. Instead of the courteous hospitality that guests deserve, I was met with thinly veiled disdain that made it clear I was not welcome in his domain. The manager didn't waste any time making his feelings known. As I approached the check-in desk, he leaned toward a nearby employee and whispered something loud enough for me and the surrounding guests to hear. His companion stifled a laugh, confirming that whatever had been said was at my expense. It wasn't even subtle. Comments about certain kinds of guests and keeping the lobby clean floated through the air, delivered with the kind of smug satisfaction that comes from believing there would be no consequences. I could feel eyes on me from all around the lobby. Travelers waiting for service, businessmen tapping away on laptops, families corralling restless kids. They all became part of the audience. Some looked uncomfortable, others amused, and a few just watched in stunned silence as the manager casually humiliated a paying guest in broad daylight. It was more than unprofessional, it was aggressive, targeted, and utterly beneath the standards of any reputable hotel. Still, I kept my expression neutral. I didn't respond to the taunts, didn't rise to the bait. There was no point in making a scene, not yet. I simply handed over my ID and reservation confirmation, giving the manager every opportunity to handle this properly. Instead, he chose to double down. With a theatrical sigh and a dramatic roll of his eyes, he typed sluggishly into the computer system, taking twice as long as necessary while tossing in passive-aggressive remarks about the kind of clientele that the hotel was starting to attract. When the check-in process finally limped to a close, he slapped the room key on the counter with a sarcastic flourish. No polite explanation of amenities. No welcome. No directions to the elevator. Just a dismissive wave, as if ushering out something unpleasant. To add insult to injury, he had assigned me one of the worst rooms in the entire hotel, a ground floor unit right next to a noisy utility closet. Clearly, this wasn't random. It was a message, "You're not wanted here." At that point, most people would have either stormed off in anger or demanded to speak to someone higher up. But I wasn't most people. Beneath my calm exterior, I was meticulously logging every word, every sneer, every condescending chuckle that echoed in that lobby. I noted the employees who joined in the laughter, the guests who witnessed it, and the tone of the manager's voice every time he spat out another derisive comment. This wasn't just a personal slight, it was a violation of the most basic principles of customer service, professionalism, and corporate ethics. The manager's arrogance was astounding. He behaved as if he were untouchable, emboldened by some imagined superiority over the guests he was paid to serve. It was clear he had grown comfortable in a toxic pattern of behavior, confident that no one would challenge him or that any complaints would be swept under the rug. In his mind, the rules didn't apply to him, especially not when it came to guests he deemed unworthy. Little did he know, his smugness had already sealed his fate. This wasn't just another guest he could bully into silence. This wasn't someone who would quietly check out and leave a bad Yelp review. No, this time he had picked the wrong person on the wrong day, and the consequences were already in motion before he even realized he had made a critical mistake. As I took the room key and turned away from the desk, I caught one final comment tossed carelessly over the counter, a jab about sending the riffraff back where they belong. It was the last nail in his professional coffin. He had humiliated me in public, treated me like less than human, and assumed he would walk away from it without repercussions. But the truth was, The person he had just alienated was someone with more authority than he could even imagine. What the manager didn't know, and what would soon become very clear, was that in the hospitality industry, reputations are fragile and corporate oversight is never far away. His world was about to be turned completely upside down, and there would be no laughing it off when the tables finally turned. After the initial humiliation during check-in, it quickly became obvious that the manager wasn't done flexing his false sense of authority. Instead of letting the encounter end with a few snide remarks and a bad room assignment, he saw an opportunity to make a public spectacle out of me. Every chance he got, he escalated his behavior, going from passive-aggressive insults to blatant attacks on my character and political beliefs, showing no fear of the consequences that should have restrained him. Throughout the day, his efforts to provoke me only intensified. He took it upon himself to loudly mock me to other guests, positioning himself as some kind of hero standing up against bigotry. Ironically, he couldn't see that he had become the very thing he claimed to despise. Using the hotel's public spaces, the lobby, the lounge, even the small cafe, he performed for an audience, ensuring everyone around knew exactly what he thought about people like me. His words weren't just unprofessional. They were discriminatory, inflammatory, and in direct violation of every corporate hospitality standard that existed. He cracked jokes at my expense within earshot, rolling his eyes whenever I passed by, shaking his head as if my mere presence was an affront to his personal values. Several employees, following his lead, joined in the subtle bullying, creating an environment so toxic that it felt staged. What was supposed to be a neutral space for relaxation had turned into a hostile arena where respect and dignity were openly disregarded. Guests who didn't even know me seemed uncomfortable witnessing it, but the manager was too drunk on his own arrogance to care. At one point, I overheard him joking with a group of guests at the bar, calling me another one of those clowns with a red hat, and warning the staff to keep an eye on that one. Not only was he humiliating a paying customer, he was actively encouraging others to view me with suspicion and disdain based solely on my appearance. This wasn't merely personal bias, it had crossed into workplace harassment, creating a hostile environment that no hotel should ever tolerate. What made it worse was his complete confidence that there would be no consequences. His behavior wasn't that of someone making a one-time mistake or having a bad day, it was systemic. It spoke to a deep-seated culture he had fostered among the staff, where mocking certain guests wasn't just tolerated but rewarded. He had built his little empire inside the hotel, complete with loyal followers who either shared his prejudices or were too intimidated to challenge them. The escalation reached a point where it could no longer be brushed off as bad customer service. It was clear that this manager had no understanding or no respect for the legal and corporate guidelines under which the hotel was supposed to operate. Federal discrimination laws, corporate non-discrimination policies, and basic human decency were being violated so openly that it begged the question: how had this behavior gone unchecked for so long? It wasn't just the MAGA hat he had a problem with. It was the entire idea that someone who didn't align with his worldview dared to walk into his hotel expecting fair treatment. His actions exposed a deeper rot, suggesting that countless others before me had probably suffered similar treatment without the tools or authority to fight back. Most guests, facing this kind of public humiliation, would have quietly left, posted an angry review, or maybe sent a complaint email that would get buried under bureaucracy. And that's exactly what the manager counted on, that people would be too embarrassed, too tired, or too powerless to stand up to him. But this time he had miscalculated. He thought he was mocking just another guest who would go away. He didn't realize that he was directly antagonizing someone who had both the authority and the corporate reach to bring real accountability to his doorstep. His casual cruelty, his lazy discrimination, and his blatant abuse of power were about to cost him dearly. At that point, it wasn't a question of if he would face consequences, it was a matter of how severely they would come down on him. Every word he said, every slight he delivered, was another nail in the coffin of his career, and every guest who witnessed his behavior would soon become a witness to his downfall. His false sense of security had blinded him to the reality that respect and professionalism aren't optional, even when you think you're invincible. By crossing the line so openly, the manager had not only jeopardized his job, but had also exposed the hotel itself to massive reputational damage, potential lawsuits, and corporate investigation. All because he couldn't resist the urge to humiliate someone who simply dared to have a different opinion. His short-sighted arrogance had lit a fire that was now burning far beyond his control, and soon the entire structure he built on bullying and favoritism would come crashing down. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I had been patient. I had tried to remain calm and avoid escalating the situation, but the manager's actions had crossed a line that I could no longer ignore. The frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over, and I knew it was time to take action, but not the kind the manager was expecting. This was no ordinary guest. The manager had no idea that the person he'd been mocking all day was far more connected than he realized. I took a deep breath and stepped outside the hotel's front entrance, away from the oppressive atmosphere. The cool evening air hit me with a refreshing clarity, and for a moment I allowed myself to reset. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the number that would turn this entire ordeal on its head. On the other end of the line was the corporate office, specifically the regional director assigned to oversee this hotel, one of the many properties under the larger umbrella of the hotel chain. While I waited for the call to connect, I couldn't help but think of all the other guests who had probably faced similar treatment. The manager's behavior was just one part of a larger issue, a toxic culture where guests were humiliated, discriminated against, and made to feel unwelcome. This had become more than about me. This was about making sure that no one else would endure the same treatment. No one else would suffer the embarrassment, the anxiety, or the frustration of walking into a place that was supposed to offer relaxation and comfort, only to be met with scorn. This had to be addressed for the sake of everyone who would walk through the doors of this hotel in the future. When the phone rang and the regional director picked up, I wasted no time. I explained the situation quickly but thoroughly, recounting the manager's behavior, the derogatory comments, and the way I had been publicly humiliated. I made sure to detail the hostility, how the manager had mocked me, and the pervasive atmosphere of discrimination that had seeped into the hotel's operations. It was important to be calm, concise, and professional, presenting the facts without getting overly emotional or sounding like a victim. I wasn't there to play the victim. I was there to ensure accountability and professionalism were restored. The director listened carefully, asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. What I hadn't yet revealed was that I wasn't just another guest upset about poor service. I was, in fact, a regional executive who had been assigned to review this very property due to previous complaints about its management. The timing could not have been more perfect, and the director was clearly taken aback when I revealed my position. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a brief moment of realization that suddenly put the situation into a new light. As soon as the director understood who I was, the tone shifted. There was no longer any question of whether the situation would be handled. It was now a matter of how quickly the issue could be addressed. Corporate's support was immediate. I could feel the authority in the director's voice as they assured me that I had their full backing and that they would personally see to it that the manager's actions would not go unchecked. They had every intention of investigating the matter thoroughly, and they gave me the green light to handle it as I saw fit, with the understanding that I would keep them updated on any developments. In that moment, I felt a rush of relief. The weight of the situation had been lifted from my shoulders. I had not only the power to change the course of my stay, but also the potential to make sure this manager faced serious consequences. I was no longer just a guest voicing a complaint. I was someone with the authority to act on behalf of corporate interests and correct this egregious wrong. The director even offered to move me to a different property if I felt uncomfortable staying at that particular hotel. But I refused. I wasn't going to run from this. I was going to stand my ground, not just for me, but for everyone who might walk into that hotel in the future. If this manager was allowed to continue his behavior unchecked, it would set a dangerous precedent that would eventually hurt the business, damage the reputation of the hotel chain, and most importantly, continue to harm other innocent guests. After a quick but important discussion about next steps, I hung up the phone, now fully in control of the situation. The power had shifted, and the manager, who had thought he could mock and humiliate me without any repercussions, was about to learn a very hard lesson in accountability. His confidence had been built on the idea that he could operate without consequence, that he could treat people however he pleased, because the likelihood of someone challenging him was low. But today, that was all about to change. I made my way back into the hotel, my mind set on the next steps. I knew that, in just a matter of hours, this manager's behavior would be thoroughly investigated and the consequences for his actions would unfold quickly. Whether it resulted in a written warning, suspension, or worse, he would not get away with what he had done. And while the manager may have thought he had won, he had, in fact, sealed his own fate with his behavior. This wasn't just about my personal satisfaction, it was about ensuring that others wouldn't suffer under the same toxic leadership. The hotel's fate and the manager's future had already been set in motion. What he didn't realize was that his small-minded vendetta had sparked something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The corporate world had just become fully aware of the situation, and that meant there would be no hiding from the fallout. As I walked back into the hotel lobby, there was a sense of calm authority that filled me, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. The time for patience and quiet frustration had passed. It was now time for action, and more importantly for the manager to understand that his behavior had consequences. I wasn't just a regular guest anymore. I had become the agent of change, the one who would hold him accountable for his actions. I was no longer simply a target of his ridicule. I was the one who held the power to make sure his behavior was corrected, and I intended to do so in a way that would leave no room for doubt about what had transpired. I approached the front desk where the manager stood, still oblivious to the fact that his time in this position was quickly running out. He greeted me with the same smugness I'd grown used to. His cocky, dismissive attitude hadn't wavered. He still thought he was untouchable, still believed that no one would dare challenge him. But that arrogance would soon be shattered, and he would soon realize that his pride had blinded him to the reality of the situation. Without missing a beat, I asked him to come to the back office for a business meeting. His expression faltered, but only for a split second. Perhaps he thought I was going to request something more mundane, a conversation about customer service, a suggestion, or a complaint. But this was not a typical meeting. This was the reckoning he never saw coming. As he followed me toward the office, the other guests who had witnessed his earlier behavior took notice, their gazes turning from casual observation to focused attention. It was clear they were curious about what was happening. Some even paused in their tracks, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Once inside the small, quiet office, I shut the door behind us and took a seat at the desk. The manager stood across from me, shifting uncomfortably as he awaited my next words. There was still a touch of cockiness in his demeanor, but it was beginning to waver. The reality of the situation was starting to dawn on him. He had no idea what I was about to reveal. I reached for the folder on my desk, one that had been prepared for this moment. It was thick with papers, but the most important document in it was the termination paperwork that would end his career at the hotel. As I slid the folder across the desk toward him, I finally revealed who I really was. I introduced myself as his new boss, and I made sure to say it with authority. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the color drained from his face. His self-assured smirk vanished, replaced by a mixture of confusion and panic. He took the folder, his hands shaking slightly, as he looked down at the paperwork in disbelief. There was a long silence in the room. He began scanning the papers, his eyes darting over the words as if hoping they were a mistake, that this was some kind of joke. But it wasn't a joke. This was real. The termination papers weren't just a formality, they were the consequences of his behavior. The very actions he had thought were protected by his position, the mocking, the harassment, the public humiliation, all of it had led to this. The worst part was that there was no escaping it. He could no longer hide behind his false sense of superiority. It was over. Meanwhile, the guests in the lobby who had watched the earlier confrontation were still observing the scene, albeit from a distance. Many of them had seen the way he treated me, the sneers, the insults, and the way he had tried to publicly shame me simply because of my political beliefs. They had been witnesses to his behavior, and now they were witnesses to his downfall. Word spread quickly through the hotel, with some guests whispering among themselves, others watching with bated breath as the confrontation unfolded. It wasn't just a personal victory for me. It was an example for them, a message that actions have consequences and that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, can get away with treating people poorly without facing the repercussions. The manager, now thoroughly deflated, stammered as he tried to piece together what was happening. He apologized, but it was too late. His apology wasn't an apology, it was an attempt to save face, a desperate plea for mercy. He begged for another chance, for an opportunity to redeem himself, but the truth was that his chances had run out long before he'd ever thought to apologize. The damage had been done, not just to me, but to his reputation, the hotel's reputation, and to the very guests he was supposed to serve with respect. I didn't respond to his pleas. There was no need. The truth was clear, and there was nothing left to say. His behavior had already spoken for itself. The only thing left now was for him to face the consequences of his actions and understand that no one was above the standards of decency and professionalism. He wasn't special. He wasn't exempt. And most importantly, he was no longer in control of the situation. The guests outside, who had been witnesses to this moment of reckoning, would remember this scene. They would remember how the bully, the one who had belittled and humiliated a guest without fear of retribution, was now the one sitting in front of a desk, holding his termination papers in hand. And that public humiliation, the moment when he realized he had crossed a line and was now paying the price, was the turning point. His arrogance had been transformed into regret, but it was too late to take any of it back. As he stood up, silently collecting his belongings, the gravity of the situation finally seemed to sink in. There was no grandiose exit, no final words. He simply walked out of the office, his pride shattered. The role reversal was complete. The man who had been the aggressor was now the one who had to leave, humiliated and defeated. I watched him go, not with satisfaction, but with a sense of justice. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It was about making sure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment he had subjected me to. His reign of arrogance had ended, and in its place, a lesson was learned. The higher you think you climb, the harder you fall when your actions catch up to you. The change that came in the wake of the toxic manager's departure was nothing short of transformative. In the days following the meeting where he had been informed of his termination, a noticeable shift began to occur at the hotel. The weight that had hung over the staff and the guests, an invisible but ever-present tension, had vanished. No longer did employees cower under the oppressive atmosphere that had been set by the previous manager. No longer did guests have to endure unprofessionalism masked as service. Instead, there was a new energy, a fresh sense of purpose, and an undeniable optimism that began to fill every corner of the hotel. I knew that this transformation would require more than just removing the toxic influence. It required a clear, actionable plan to reshape the culture of the hotel from the ground up. The first step was to call for a staff meeting, a space where everyone, no matter their role or tenure, could voice their thoughts and expectations for the future. The aim was to reset the tone of the hotel, where respect and professionalism were no longer afterthoughts, but the foundation on which everything else was built. The room was full of eager faces, some apprehensive, others hopeful. The staff had lived under the weight of the old manager's attitude for far too long, and they had grown used to not being heard. Many had stopped voicing their concerns or offering suggestions because they knew it wouldn't make a difference. But as I began speaking, something shifted. The words I spoke weren't just promises, they were a call to action. I outlined the new standards for the hotel, ensuring that every employee knew what was expected of them, but more importantly, what they could expect from me as their new leader. I made it clear that from that point forward, the hotel would operate with a culture of mutual respect and accountability. Employees who felt undervalued or ignored were encouraged to speak up and share their ideas. Every guest, no matter their background or appearance, would be treated with the same high level of courtesy and attention. No longer would anyone be subjected to the rude, demeaning behavior that had once been normalized. The hotel's success would no longer be measured by how much profit we could make, but by the satisfaction of those who entered our doors, both guests and staff alike. The response from the team was overwhelmingly positive. The change in the air was palpable. It was as though a fog had lifted and people were suddenly empowered to do their best work. They were ready to embrace the new atmosphere where their contributions were valued and their voices heard. The dynamic that emerged in the following weeks was incredible. Where once there had been tension, there was now collaboration. Where there had been fear, there was now trust. The employees, who had been demoralized under the old regime, now felt like they were part of something bigger, something that respected and appreciated their worth. Guests immediately noticed the difference as well. The previously disjointed and dismissive service had been replaced by a team of attentive, courteous professionals who genuinely cared about providing an exceptional experience. Where once guests had been met with cold indifference, they were now greeted with warm smiles and a readiness to serve. Complaints, which had once been met with excuses or outright dismissal, were now handled promptly and with care. The transformation was immediate, and the word began to spread. The hotel's reputation, which had taken a severe blow under the old manager, began to heal. Positive reviews flooded in, with guests specifically praising the change in the hotel's atmosphere. Many guests commented on how friendly and attentive the staff had become, while others noted how much more welcoming and professional the hotel felt. Business picked up as new guests arrived, curious about the renewed energy and the rave reviews. The hotel, which had been teetering on the edge of losing its credibility, was now firmly on the path to recovery. As for the ex-manager, he learned the hard way that no one is untouchable. The world, as it turned out, was much smaller than he had ever imagined. The connections we form and the relationships we build have a way of coming full circle. His actions, which he had believed to be inconsequential, had far-reaching consequences. The people he had belittled and humiliated me and my colleagues were not powerless. In fact, it was these very individuals who had the ability to determine his future. The power dynamics he thought he controlled had shifted completely. The arrogance that had once defined him had been his downfall. The ripple effect of his departure was felt throughout the industry. As it turned out, word about his behavior had spread beyond the hotel's walls, and many people began to take notice. His name became associated with the kind of behavior that no one wanted to tolerate. The professional network he had once relied on began to disintegrate, and it wasn't long before he found himself struggling to find new opportunities. The same entitlement that had allowed him to treat others poorly now left him isolated and without support. For me, this wasn't about getting revenge. It wasn't about taking pleasure in his downfall. It was about ensuring that the right people were in charge, those who understood the value of respect, integrity, and professionalism. It was about creating a space where everyone from the staff to the guests could thrive. In the end, the manager's departure had sparked a transformation not just for the hotel, but for everyone involved. The new era at the hotel was one of collaboration, respect, and positivity. It was a place where everyone had a voice, where guests were treated like family, and where employees felt supported and valued. It was a hotel that had been given a second chance, and this time it would not be squandered. The lessons learned through this difficult experience would not be forgotten, and the hotel's future was brighter than ever before. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more jaw-dropping tales, make sure to subscribe to expect stories for even more shocking encounters and unforgettable twists.